Welcome back to the Autoblog Podcast. I'm Greg Migliore. We have an awesome show for you this week. It's jam-packed with a lot of news, including the new BMW M5, something called the Aston Martin Valiant. It's not a Plymouth. Stay with us. We'll explain. Rivian and Volkswagen are doing a tie-up. We'll talk about some other things that have been going on this week as well. It's been a busy week in the car world, so it's a good time to bring in our news editor, Joel Stocksdale. What's up, man?
Hey, not too much.
All right. A lot going on here. These long summer nights here, lots of stuff, lots of time to drive some cool things. And things I've been driving include the new Chevy Suburban, which was refreshed for 2025. Joel spent some time in the Porsche Cayenne, the GTS version, which is pretty cool. And he's also been in the Land Cruiser 1958. And he spent, I believe, a day or two in the Lamborghini Huracán Sterrato, which we talked about last week. But hey, it was a pretty cool car, so we'll get Joel's take on that. We will spend your money. It's a good one. All right. So with that, basically the first full week of summer, let's kick things off with a new BMW M5. Lots of horsepower, 717. That's it's like Hellcat territory, basically, right? Kind of a funky new design, which I think, I don't know. BMWs, it's hard for me to even comment on the design because I feel like they do start to look pretty different in person. It's also a plug-in hybrid. There we go. That's a bit to unpack. But hey, the 911 was going hybrid as well, which we talked about a few weeks ago, and we had that story up. So definitely a different, I think, world here for some of our very familiar performance cars. What do you think of the new M5, Joel?
Yeah, I mean, I actually kind of like the way it looks, and surprisingly, it seemed like a few of us on staff kind of dig it. The front grille looks a little funny. I've got this thing. BMW has done some odd stuff trying to hide their forward kind of collision sensors and stuff, and it always looks a little bit weird. But overall, it looks all right. I do appreciate that it actually seems to have some legitimate electric range. It's, at this point, not amazing, but it is a performance car. It's got an estimated 25 miles of electric range, which, that'll actually take you somewhere. There have been a couple of high-performance plug-in hybrids from other automakers that have, no range. The one that I'm thinking of particularly, the Mercedes-AMG GT 63 SE Performance V8, which that mouthful only has 7 miles of range, despite being a plug-in hybrid, which feels very much kind of trying to meet some sort of compliance requirement in Europe. But a lot has been made about the M5 being quite heavy now.
The M5's never been particularly lithe, I think, in modern times. But when you add some, plug-in hybrid running gear, it's definitely going to make it heavier. Which I will say this, with the M5, I'm willing to accept a little bit of extra ballast because it's just a big car. It's a super sedan. I think with the M3, that's where I get a little more, that's not what I want for the M3. So I'm willing to accept that, I think, a bit with the M5.
But this is 1,000 pounds over the last one.
It's a lot. They're going to have a tough time selling that, I think, to the hardcore enthusiasts and purists. When you read that fine print.
Yeah. And I mean, BMW can make something really heavy work surprisingly well. The BMW XM is a good example of that because that's a huge SUV with a lot of power and being a plug-in hybrid, but it drives surprisingly well.
It's got big, meaty tires, 6-piston front calipers in the front, similar suspension setup from the regular 5 Series. And it also has this thing called boost control, which you can only do between 20 and 90 miles an hour. You basically grab one of the paddle shifters and hold on for dear life. So these boost modes, these sort of fancy, acceleration tip-in things, launch controls, that's really becoming all the rage for performance vehicles, especially EVs, but plug-in hybrids as well. And that should add some zestiness to this pretty big car.
Yeah, those boost modes they're interesting. I don't know how I feel about them completely, because I guess it seems like less of sort of like a boost button and more of like a drive mode, like a temporary drive mode button in all of these applications. Because when I think of a boost button, like what I'm imagining is sort of like a Fast and the Furious, like I press the button and the second I hit it, the car starts accelerating even harder than it was before. But none of them seem to kind of work that way. It's more because even in our story we talk about like the way this boost mode works is that you have to hold down the left shift paddle for more than a second, and then it kind of like then you have access to the extra power when you floor it. I don't know. I guess none of them quite work the way I would like them to. It's probably for safety and legal reasons, because you don't want somebody just accidentally pressing a button and the car suddenly accelerating a lot harder than it was initially. I don't know. I've got weird mixed feelings about it.
I mean, all the different, whether it's boost mode or like the watts to freedom, wide open watts on the Chevy EVs, they're all they're different flavors. They're different, slightly, like setups for their mission. But I mean, part of me is also like, you kind of wonder how safety isn't an issue. Maybe it is, I don't know. But it also just seems like, why? I remember driving an Audi TT-RS in Europe. They were all excited about this launch control thing, which was amazing. You pushed a couple buttons and then, jumped on the throttle, let go of the brakes, the way you went. And we were all kind of like, so when can you use this? And they're like, well, here on this racetrack, this former Formula One racetrack in, I think it was Portugal. So I don't know. They're party tricks is what they are, I think. It is, though. I mean, it's a torque monster. You get a lot of that. You get 0 to 60 in 3.4 seconds. That's pretty quick. You can get a lot of the traditional M goodies like the driver's package. In the top torque, 1800 RPM is when it comes on. And you can do that all the way to 5400. So it's a very torquey beast. This is the 4.4 liter V8, if you're curious. So, I'm excited to drive this. This is, a twin turbo V8 M5. I'm excited. I think looking at more of the pictures, again, it's a little tough to tell because it's a green car that we're seeing in most of these pictures. It's almost sedate is not the right word, but it's pretty chill compared to what BMW has been doing with some of their crazy designs, with the huge grills, the crazy angles, things like that, like the M2 come to mind and M4. But hey, so I kind of like the restrained look. It reminds me a little bit, and this is not a diss, of the new Honda Accord. Just smooth, clean, even proportions, not trying to do too much. So, yeah. I think the best thing to do here is check out the story written by Byron Hurd. That's on our website. You can see these pictures, dig into the story. We've basically probably read his story front to back for you. So get in there, check it out. Get into the comments. We'd love to hear what you think of the new M5. And we have the Aston Martin Valiant. This came out yesterday. It's a limited edition, pretty wild looking thing. You wrote the story, Joel. Why don't you kind of take us through it?
Yeah, so the Aston Martin Valiant is basically a faster, more exclusive special edition of an already fast and exclusive special Aston Martin model. And this one is sort of, I guess you could maybe say, curated by F1 champion and current F1 driver Fernando Alonso. The Valiant, it's based on the Valor, which is one of many V-named vehicles, including the Aston Martin Victor, which was a one-off, and the Aston Martin Vantage, which is a more series production vehicle. And that's why you've got something called Valiant, because at some point you're going to start running out of exciting words that start with V. So we've got the Aston Valiant for now, and basically what has changed is they added 30 horsepower to this over the regular Valor. They also gave it a bunch of really aggressive carbon fiber bodywork. It's got a big rear wing, and it's got big side skirts and a front splitter and diffuser. All of these carbon fiber aero things. It's got smooth carbon fiber aero covers over magnesium wheels. And kind of the big showpiece then inside is that, like the Valor, it has a actual 6-speed manual transmission. And in the Valiant, the center console is cut away so that you can see all of the shifter linkages and components.
I think that's a very nuanced technical take on some of the things it can do. It strikes me maybe I'm hung up too much on the word Valiant. It reminds me of when Ford was trying to make all their cars start with F or sometimes E. Little unnecessary. I think we all obviously think of the Plymouth Valiant, which I know is kind of cheesy, but so it goes. Pictures of this thing are wild, though. Just there is no rear windshield. You look at the rear, kind of like that raked roof line that goes right into the spoiler. Head and taillights are wild. Maybe we should let Fernando Alonso drive some more or design some more cars. Seems like he did a pretty good job with this one.
Yeah, it's striking. I think I may actually prefer the Valor slightly more. The rear wing might be a little bit much for me, which feels a little bit odd for me to say that because I do tend to like kind of ridiculous cars, but I think in this case, the wing is just maybe a little bit much. But either way, it does look nice. The gold color seems to be pretty fitting for it, even though I can't really think of much that I would associate gold with Aston Martin with. I mean, I guess there was Goldfinger, the James Bond movie. But,
GoldenEye?
The other kind of big feature on the Valiant is that it gets upgraded with Multimatic spool valve shocks because they go in everything that has amazing suspension, whether it's a Ford GT or even a Chevy Colorado ZR2.
I think I actually like the Valiant more than the Valor. If I were spending my money, I would maybe go with the Valiant. I don't know. They both look pretty sick. And that the gear shifter that you mentioned, you laid that out really well. That is just so cool. I think as we get more into like everything digital, everything AI, some of these like true, even exposed sort of mechanical elements where you can, man in machine, see what, like how your car is working or just a little closer to the actual, analog nature of it is cool. You see this sometimes with skeleton watches. The recent Bugatti, that interior that we saw was very old school, like almost like 100 years ago, old school. It looked like, the dawn of the auto industry. So I would like to see more of that, to be honest. I don't think, screens are great. We'll talk about them like in the Suburban. They can be great. And you don't want to look dated, but I think there's a time and a place. And maybe that could be a way we differentiate some of these other like trim levels. You get one that's a little more basic, a little more mechanical. So this is cool. You got to check it out. Nice job on the story there, Joel. Let's talk about this tie-up between Rivian and Volkswagen. News came down yesterday. We reported this on Tuesday evening. We're recording the show on Wednesday morning. And basically, Volkswagen's going to invest $5 billion into Rivian, and then they will set up this joint venture where they will share development and, kind of walk hand in hand to the EV future. In simple terms, this helps Volkswagen get some access to electric vehicle technology and software development and platforms and a lot of the secret sauce that Rivian has. And for many times, I would say in the last probably decade, investors, enthusiasts, like Rivian has been, I think, second only to Tesla as far as the EV maker that's most in the news, most generating buzz. Amazon invested in them. Ford invested in them. I think Amazon still is invested in them, but Volkswagen may have more of an equity stake after this. But they had a really rough first quarter. Like a really bad first quarter. You can check out the story as far as just how much money they lost and things didn't go well. So they needed some cash. And I think this gives them money and time to sort out their strategy until this new portfolio of vehicles like the R2 comes to market. Because right now they have two very good vehicles, the R1S and the R1T, but they're fairly expensive. I think a few years ago when they launched, they seemed more expensive relative to the field. Now with inflation and car prices going up, and just what these things are, they're very substantial, borderline luxury vehicles. I think people are willing to pay the money for that if they, could get them. And also they just launched a refreshed versions of both the R1S and the R1T. So all that is to say is they need some time and they need some money, and Volkswagen's going to give it to them. What's interesting now is Volkswagen, gets to kind of go behind the curtain and, get access to some of Rivian's stuff, which is a big boost for Volkswagen. They have the money. Volkswagen has plenty of money, cash on hand. So I think it's a good move for Volkswagen. For Rivian, I also think it's a good move, but I also think it's always tough when you're letting somebody who's like bigger than you have control over like sort of what makes you special. So I think that's always a slippery slope. But Tesla did it for a while with Mercedes and other companies, and it helped them stay afloat. So I think this is a win-win as we try to break this down. But we shall see. What do you think of this? What do you make of this?
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think the biggest thing, honestly, Rivian probably, at least short term, gets the most out of this because they get the money. And being a startup in the car industry is very, very expensive. Being an established player in the car industry is very expensive, but not as expensive as getting into it. Rivian needs all the money they can get, especially since they are trying to expand and build out their lineup. They've got the smaller R2 line coming up soon. And even beyond that, the R3 hatchback, which has been previewed. So, anything that can get cash-wise will be very helpful. And it seems that VW in particular is going to be getting software assistance from Rivian, which I think is going to be very, very good for Volkswagen because, we've experienced some of their infotainment systems and things, and they're not great. Even their kind of improved ones, are still kind of lagging behind some of the better systems in the industry. So I think both can benefit. Rivian is probably benefiting the most upfront. But there's potential for both companies to benefit kind of in the future if they decide to expand their collaboration more so. I mean, in the event that Rivian is able to sort of use some VW components and things here and there, that can save them a lot of money in development and production for making more affordable vehicles or more profitable. And I'm sure VW would not mind getting a little bit of EV expertise from Rivian in some aspects. That's not to say that VW is necessarily struggling in that department, but because, they're from like kind of the entry-level ID stuff, which is pretty decent overall, and then kind of their high-performance stuff, which is quite impressive. But there's can always be room to improve. What will be interesting is as Volkswagen starts to roll out their Scout line to see kind of how that plays into things, because it feels a little bit like the Scout brand will be almost kind of like a direct competitor to Rivian in the future. And maybe that can lead to some kind of components and platform sharing in the future, since they'd be kind of similar vehicles, but at the same time, possibly some internal competition. It's interesting, but I think like at least short term, both companies are going to benefit.
Yeah, there's a ton of questions here. And like I said, it's always confusing to me, I think, when you sort of not merge, but really tie up with a competitor like this, because it's sort of like, ultimately, don't you want to kind of beat the competitor and be ahead of them, not team up with them? But I guess it's an interesting business philosophy. I think you also are in the situation too where the Scout Rivian thing is very much unanswered. We did Byron Hurd, our associate editor, got a no comment from Scout. So if you read our story, we have that. I don't think everybody else has that quite layer in their story. So Scout is definitely an interesting element to this. But on the other hand, Scout is, they've been billed as being independent. So theoretically, it's sort of like a arm's length relationship, although there was supposed to be like a little bit of some sort of sharing commonalities with the broader Volkswagen group when appropriate. So we don't know what that means. We also know Volkswagen has a lot of electric vehicles. It's interesting to me that they would kind of have Scout over here doing their own thing, but then they're going to team up with Rivian. And also they have the ID4, they have the ID3, they're going to roll out the bus. I assume they think this will just accelerate their EV efforts for the Volkswagen proper group, because, on one hand, it seems like they already have the tech. I guess it's not the biggest ringing endorsement of your existing tech, if you look at it that way too, if you've got to go out and team up with this relatively new company. So all that's to say, I don't see a downside for Volkswagen. I think all the details in here affect the smaller parties. Whereas for Volkswagen, you write the check, you get the stuff. I mean, to me, take the deal for Volkswagen. It's a slam dunk. People seem to like it for Rivian, at least on the street. Their stock went up 40% this morning. And I think that that's indicative of the fact that there's so much uncertainty around EV companies. And I think investors are always worried they're going to run out of money. Whereas as enthusiasts, we're just like, oh man, look at this cool new thing they're doing. So this sort of kind of solves some of those problems. Money can be a problem. All righty. So let's run through a couple of interesting concepts we saw this week. They're from almost 20 years ago. There's a Cadillac concept that kind of previewed much of the design that we're seeing right now in Cadillacs on the road, as well as the original Pontiac G8 concept. GM Design has an awesome Instagram account. You should probably follow it. We have no connection with them, obviously, but just a plug. It's a really cool thing to follow. And this gives you kind of a insight into how, what they were thinking 20 years ago, as well as, just some of the cool stuff they could do. The Cadillac design, I think, is interesting. It was rolled out at the Eyes on Design car show in Grosse Pointe a couple of weeks ago here in Metro Detroit. And it's a design car show. It's a really good show. I've only been a couple times. But it really focuses on design. So the GM design team was like, hey, we have this awesome concept. We've never really shown it in person. We've kind of sort of talked about it. Let's roll it out. What are we waiting for? And, if you look at it, you can really see a lot of the elements, especially in the grille, that have shown up in modern Cadillacs. I think that one looks slick. I know you wrote the story. You like this Cadillac?
Yeah. Cadillac seems to nail almost every single concept car that they ever do. The frustrating thing is that so many of their concepts never really reach reality. I mean, you'll see elements of each of their concepts, but they've had a lot of spectacular cars that just have never made it to production. The Celestiq is really kind of the first one, which I'm glad. The Celestiq is cool. But I can rattle off names of other Cadillac concepts from the past, like El Mirage and CL and CN, and they've had a bunch of them. This is another one that's really pretty. And even more shocking is the fact that this one was fully an internal concept. It was not shown until this past weekend. And it was built a number of years ago.
It's interesting too, if you look at the front end, the grille, the lights, the proportions, I mean, that is the CT4 and CT5, basically. After they got past that sort of 2010s generation of the Cadillac sedans that were very razor sharp, razor edged in every way. You could shave with them. Recently, I think they've gone back to a little more understated design, and this concept shows like where they were going. It's a little over the top compared to what's on the road, but not much. So I think it looks great, and I really like the current generation of Cadillac sedans. I think they hit that right balance between being, prestigious, premium looking, luxury. They're Cadillacs, but also pretty good looking, sporty, athletic looking cars. So you can see where it all started. And then where it all started and ended for Pontiac was this G8 concept, which I don't like this as much, but it's just a random, interesting trivia question. The G8 ended up not looking a whole hell of a lot like this. This kind of looks like a big Solstice, I guess, would be the way I would put it. It's very much an early 2000s concept car. It reminds me a little bit of the original Chevy Volt concept as far as just, like the materials and the closer up you get to it, the faker it looks. But this has been around since '08. I don't know. They ended up making the G8. It was based on the Australian division, Holden's, underpinnings. So they didn't really stray too far from that. I forget the car. Was it the Commodore? Is that what it was based on?
Yeah, so the production G8 actually launched like basically the year before
this concept was kind of finished. This concept was from 2008.
Well, or like the same year as when the production G8 launched, and the production G8 was based on the Holden Commodore.
Yeah.
And yeah, this thing is a big departure from, because the production car was just genuinely a rebadged Holden. Like, they put the Pontiac kidneys on it, and that was about it.
Mm-hmm.
This thing, I definitely agree. It does kind of look like a blown up version of the original Chevy Volt concept. The way the kind of windowsill line sort of dips down a little bit. And it's got a long nose. It's got the hatchback rear and kind of a short rear. And yeah, it definitely has sort of like Solstice Sky inspiration, particularly in the rear of it, kind of the shape of the taillights and stuff. And like, it's got vertical headlights, and like the grille is like way low down in the front. It's a striking car, and it is very 2000s.
To your point, and you said it better than I did, I was kind of mixing up the timeline. Like, this is sort of like maybe what they could have done next had GM truly designed the G8 and Pontiac had survived, which it obviously did not. I like the G8. I drove it. I drove the V6 and the V8 versions. I thought it was, for what it was, which was a rebadged Australian car, it was pretty damn good. I had fun with it. I really, I thought they got it right. I think they, Pontiac, sort of their mission was to reply to the Dodge Charger at that point. And, the resources at GM were dwindling by the minute in that time period in the run up to bankruptcy. So they did what they could, and it was a very good car, I thought. I mean, relatively speaking, but it was fun. I thought it looked pretty good. I remember Automobile magazine, speaking of something that's no longer around, did a comparison with BMWs and Audis, and they liked it too. So not a bad used car.
And it is interesting to see this, because it was literally the year after, in 2009, the Pontiac was officially shut down. So it's just interesting to kind of see this and to sort of see like where Pontiac might have gone. And I mean, even like the G8 did technically get a successor in the Chevy SS, but that was still just a rebadged version of the Holden, whereas this concept seems to suggest potentially doing something significantly more kind of changed and modified for Pontiac specifically, as opposed to just a badge job. Yeah, it's interesting stuff.
Yeah, as I look at the pictures, I actually prefer the car that was a little closer to the Holden than this concept. I think it's just cleaner, more almost European. I liked it. I drove the big V8 too back in the day. It was a beast. It was not a particularly heavy car. And if I'm remembering right, there was a 6-speed manual. So it was that like, kind of notchy 6-speed manual from 15 years ago. But yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't mind getting another spin in a G8. Maybe GM's got one in the Heritage Collection somewhere. But let's go to the present and talk about the new Jetta. You wrote this story. This is the new Jetta. I think it's a pretty important car for Volkswagen, obviously. Manual drops away a little bit, but you can still get it in the GLI, which I think is okay, because if you want a manual transmission, you probably would veer towards that version anyway. So you are the news editor and you wrote the story. Why don't I let you ramble on about it?
Yeah, so the new Jetta is, to be honest, despite the new front fascia and interior tweaks, it's pretty much the same Jetta as before. I think the new styling looks quite nice, to be honest. Actually, an improvement over the old one. It's just much cleaner and simpler. Kind of more like what you would expect of sort of kind of Volkswagen maybe 10 to 20 years ago. And I say that in a good way. Not to say that it's not dated, but it just has kind of a cleaner look than sort of the last few years of Jetta. The new sort of trim along the front bumper, I think, looks particularly nice on the GLI where it's bright red. And, beyond that, it really has not changed much. It's got a bigger infotainment screen, which runs a newer version of Volkswagen's infotainment, which, as we touched on a little bit with the Rivian and VW stuff, it's definitely a big improvement over what they had been putting in their into the VW line, particularly the ID cars, but it's still not amazing. Powertrains are basically the same. I'm definitely disappointed that they're dropping the manual from the regular Jetta, because a number of us have driven that version of the Jetta, and it's kind of a secret bargain for like an enthusiast, because you got a turbo engine which had good torque and felt punchy, and like a half decent manual transmission that meant that you could use the most of it, all for less than $25,000. It also got great fuel economy and was in a comfortable, roomy car. So it's kind of sad that that's gone. You can still get it with an 8-speed automatic, and thankfully the GLI is still around, and the GLI can still be had with a manual transmission, which is not something that you can say for kind of the Golf GTI and Golf R, which are going to dual clutch transmission only.
Yeah.
And the GLI is also surprisingly cheap at the moment. They haven't announced pricing for the new one, but we're expecting it should still be pretty affordable, which would mean that you can get the GLI for potentially less than even like a Civic Si. We'll have to see when the full pricing comes out.
I kind of wonder if there will be at any point a pivot back to sedans just for daily driving, like small family. Second car is in like maybe the family car is the large crossover that every American seems to have, but just something else. Because I drove the Camry last week and it was outstanding. I put my whole family in there, dog, everybody fits. The Jetta is obviously a different class, but it's still a very good value. It's fuel efficient. You get the kind of Volkswagen-y just vibe about it, quirky, cheeky, that kind of thing. I know several Jetta owners who still are driving very old Jettas. It's like they have that existing base. So I think the companies that stick with them, like Toyota, Honda, Volkswagen, Hyundai, I think there's some room to run. And this new one, I think it's not a dramatic change, but I think smart move by Volkswagen to kind of stay with it, stay the course, and try to pick up some sales.
Well, I think I'm not entirely sure sedans are going to come back around, but I think genuinely what is going to be a key thing is affordability. Volkswagen even noted that the Jetta sales have gone up a lot in the last year. They compared with year-to-date sales for last year, Jetta sales have been more than double this year. And they said that like a big part of that is that financing has gotten expensive, so people are moving down to more affordable vehicles, and the Jetta is one of them. And what we didn't talk about is while full pricing is not available, the base model Jetta pricing is, and since the manual is no longer available, comparing automatic to automatic, the new one is actually a couple $100 cheaper than last year's model. And I think that's going to be, I think, a big deal for buyers in the next couple of years. And like, if you can keep your prices down and still have like a competent product, you're going to sell a lot of them. I think that's what VW is seeing right now.
23,295 is a very aggressive price point. I mean, even for, like, we know the Jetta has never been super expensive, relatively speaking, but I mean, that's almost like Hyundai territory as far as coming in with a really aggressive, well-equipped product. So, I'm interested to drive this thing. It's been a minute since I've been in a Jetta. And I think the GLI would be the flavor I would like. I do like the Volkswagen. It's the dual clutch, right? I do like those as well. But the manual, Volkswagen does good manuals, in my opinion. So, all right. Speaking of price, the ever elusive $25,000 EV. Everybody seems to want to make one or not make one in the case of Tesla, but they still might be working on one. We don't really know. The Model 2. You were in New York a few weeks ago. The Renegade apparently is going to be reborn as an EV for about that much. We're going to get the Bolt coming back in fairly short order. Ford doesn't seem to know what they're doing, at least publicly facing. And, the rest of the industry is somewhere in between. So I think what's critical to pull out here is this is something that would probably bring EVs to many more buyers. And I think when you kind of look at the field of, what would get somebody to buy an EV, it's like, well, charging, range anxiety, and price. And this would solve it for many people. I will say this, I think the Renegade could be, that could be an interesting option for a lot of people, because I like the old Renegade, the ICE one. I think as an EV and as a Jeep, I think you're starting to tick a lot of boxes here that could get people interested. So you know more about this car than I do because you wrote the original story on it. You were among the first. I think at some point we've got to see a $25,000 EV, much like this Jetta is, for sedan buyers. It's got to be available for more people. So, I mean, what do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely going to happen, and I don't think it's going to take too long to get there. The Chevy Bolt, the last one, was pretty much there. It was just it was just like a few $1,000s more than 25K, and that was like MSRP. That wasn't even including tax credits and stuff. So I think we're very close, and I think Chevy might be able to beat Stellantis to it. And I only say that because with the Renegade, it seemed like they were kind of hinting towards closer to like 2027 as launching that, since it's going to be there haven't been any Renegade variants kind of introduced yet. And it's going to be based on presumably a Stellantis platform that has not been introduced to the US yet. We're expecting it to be the Stellantis Smart Car platform, which they're using for a couple of small EVs in Europe. One of them being the Citroen EC3. So it should be fairly small, and it's probably still being kind of sorted out, the US spec version of it. Expecting it to use lithium iron phosphate battery chemistry, which is cheaper to make. It's very long lasting, a little bit temperature sensitive, more so than the currently more common nickel, manganese, cobalt chemistry. And the other thing is that it sounds like Jeep is going to need tax credits to get to that like $25,000-ish price point. So that might not even be $25,000 MSRP. That may be after incentives. And to get those incentives, they're going to have production in the US. So there's a good chance that Jeep needs to set up some production facilities in the next year or so to handle components for electric Renegade. And all of those reasons are why I kind of think Chevy is more likely to have its next generation Bolt out before we see the Renegade. Granted, we don't really have many details about the next Bolt, but we also know that Chevy built the first gen Bolt for a while here. It's mostly working out the kinks with its Ultium platform. And some aspect of Ultium we believe is going to be utilized in the new Bolt. So I'm expecting Chevy to kind of get there first. We also haven't seen pricing yet for the Kia EV3, which is another strong contender for being like a very cheap EV in the US market. Since that is very much going to be marketed as kind of like the entry point for Kia Electric, even below Kia Niro. So that should be pretty darn affordable. We'll see if it's as cheap or cheaper than like Equinox EV. And you mentioned Ford, and they do seem to be a bit of an enigma at the moment. Like we just haven't. It feels like we haven't really heard a lot about kind of like their upcoming electrification plans. Like Mach-E and Lightning came out, and it's been quiet since.
Yeah, I mean, they took some really big cuts a few years ago, and it seems like we haven't seen much since, to your point. You know, Mach-E, Lightning, enormous tentpole pillar vehicles. Jim Farley took the dramatic step of trying to like essentially divide the company into like ICE and EV and commercial. So they really talked a big game, but the follow-up hasn't been there. And honestly, reading between the lines, it feels like they've been kind of backtracking a little bit. They're talking a lot about hybrids these days, plug-in hybrids. Like, honestly, they sound a little bit more like Toyota than they did a few years ago. Whereas General Motors, Mary Barra have been very, they haven't let up. They've just been like, no, we're doing EVs. Of course, we're going to do some still V8s, other vehicles, Corvettes and things like that. But this is, they've taken different paths. I'll be curious to see what Ford does, because sometimes these things fly below the radar. And then all of a sudden it'll be like, hey, here's the new Ford Escort. It'll be $26,000 and, it'll just be there. So I guess we shall see. I tend to think pricing right now with EVs, it reminds me a lot of fuel economy. A few years ago, and by a few, I mean like 10, 15, car companies were like, we can't do this. It's impossible. The Ford Fiesta got like 29 miles to the miles per gallon. And they were like, this is the best we could do. You've got to drive these econo boxes. And then lo and behold, like the Camry I just drove got 45 miles per gallon. So I think it'll be a problem, and then it will happen.
Yeah. Well, and GM has also said that they are going to be refocusing a little bit to offer some more hybrids. And I think what I think is funny is that whereas a lot of people had kind of felt like Stellantis was lagging, I kind of think they actually may have sort of the sweet strategy for kind of short to medium term by making their platforms capable of doing both. And so they can kind of adjust here and there, like how many EVs versus hybrids that they do, and kind of adjust their supply to meet demand.
All right. Sounds good. So check out the story. We've got a kind of a recap of where everybody stands. That's on our site right now. You can obviously read Joel's story about what the new Renegade will entail. But let's move along and talk about the Porsche Cayenne, which you drove. We'll tell everybody what you drove. It was the GTS. So tell us about this crossover.
Yeah, so it is yet another very carefully positioned slice of Porsche-ness. It's like, Porsche is an expert at carving out the thinnest little niches across their lineups. The GTS is kind of one of them, and it offers a bunch of equipment that you can get on Cayenne S. But if you add all of that equipment to Cayenne S, it would end up being more expensive than the base GTS. And then the base GTS, in addition to including all those features, it also gets more power and gets a couple of additional features on top of that. So it's this weird thing where like this sort of higher end Cayenne trim level is also like a good is in a little bit of a way a bargain. It's kind of weird. But yeah, it makes 493 horsepower and 486 pound-feet of torque, which so you get it's an improvement over the regular S. You also get torque vectoring, you get active air suspension, and it's a very good SUV. The Cayenne in general, it's a very good SUV, and the GTS is just sort of about the sportiest one you can get, short of the turbo e-hybrid. And it's a Porsche. It's very good. The steering is very precise, impressively communicative. It rides surprisingly well. The V8 is really responsive, and it's interesting because Porsche has been moving a lot of its V8s to, instead of having twin scroll turbos, which are known for being super responsive, to more conventional single scroll turbos, and that's a result of having to meet different emissions requirements, and it works better with kind of the exhaust system. But they've done other things to kind of make up for that. They've added variable valve timing and lift, kind of like VTEC in a Honda or VVTi in a Toyota or Mailbag in a Mitsubishi. And genuinely, like, it feels as responsive as ever. It's a great engine with a great transmission. There's not really anything bad to say about it. It's just a really good SUV.
I got to give Porsche credit for the way they set up their engine lineups. They always give you just enough power that you can have a great time. And their engines always sound great. That's a testament to the engines and the exhaust, of course. But they don't overkill. You look at, like, say, Dodge's approach to marketing through horsepower, and Porsche's like, this is what you need. It's going to be great. You're going to have a great time. And it's really well tailored for each vehicle. And to your point, regardless of the trim level, Cayennes, I think, have the best steering of any crossover. It's just you get like a Porsche, set up in that. So in addition to these, very compelling new versions, if you're an enthusiast and you're looking for like a used crossover, maybe you want to try and let somebody else take that depreciation hit, that can be a fun way to get into a Porsche, like a Cayenne, and use it as a daily driver and then drive it for a while. So that's something I tell people when they're like, well, I'm looking to get some sort of a crossover but I also want something fun. And that usually is sort of like, people don't know what they want. It's like, you want something fun, you want a Miata, but you also need a 3-row crossover. Like there's too much dissonance going on here. But used Cayenne could really fit your mission in life. So let's transition to another SUV. This is the 2025 Chevy Suburban. The 2024 Chevy Suburban. The new one, the 2025, gets a fair amount of upgrades and things like that. Basically, it's a slightly different looking. They kind of thinned out the LED headlights and made the interior a bit different and tweaked the suspension. All of that is to say, I drove the 2024 High Country. Still a very nice vehicle. It's, again, I would say if you can get a good deal on a 2024, I don't think you need to wait to get a 2025 because the upgrades are pretty slim. This one was very nicely apportioned. I had the big V8, which, there is no replacement for displacement when you're rolling around with, big V8 in a Suburban. You definitely have that king of the road feel. High country trim is just loaded. It's a lovely interior. This one had literally the wheels were called something to the effect of sterling silver. Like I got to find the exact term here for it, but it was crazy. I had painted the radiant red tint coat, so everybody saw me coming in this thing too. Sunroof, which in a vehicle this big is always something, all for the princely price of just under $95,000, which seems like a lot for a Suburban, but it's a, again, very solid vehicle. And, I enjoyed my time with it. I think the bigger upgrade was a few years ago, around 2021, I think, when they, gave these things, they tweaked the suspension, which made them handle better. This is the Suburban and also the Tahoe. Also opened up a little bit more cargo space. So I think that was helpful. And, the interiors of the Tahoe and the Suburban just keep getting better. I think that's where you're really seeing some, differentiation from the Silverado and the Sierra. It's less like a truck inside and very much like a nice interior. So that's a Suburban, hauled a bunch of stuff. Ironically, the day after the Suburban went back, I used a Range Rover Velar to go haul 7 bags of mulch. Probably should have reversed that, but hey, that was just my schedule. But the Suburban, family loved it, plenty of room for everything. And I would argue 95 is a lot, but it's still a pretty good value given that it's enormous and you can do a lot of things with it. So that's a Suburban. Let's move along to another SUV, the Land Cruiser 1958. I have not been in the new Land Cruiser yet, so I'm kind of jealous. You have the 1958, which I believe gives you round headlights and some other cool stuff. This probably is your first take on the Land Cruiser, right? What did you think of it?
Yeah, and it was a very brief stint because I was driving it over to John Snyder's house to drop it off with him since I was swapping it for another vehicle, which we'll touch on briefly after this. And yeah, it was my first time in it, and it was interesting. It looks great, and yes, the 1958 does get the round headlights. And well, what I guess was really surprising to me, I told John that it might be the 1958 trim, but the interior feels more like 1990 because it is really, really bare and really, really plain. It's lots and lots of hard black plastic. The seats are one kind of cloth over every single panel, and it's sort of this black and white sort of or kind of black and gray kind of melange of fabric, and it's on every single, like, most new cars usually have like different patterns for like the inserts or the bolsters or the headrest. Like, they do some things to kind of mix things up. Not on the Land Cruiser 1958. Every single bit of cloth on there is the same kind of cloth. It had manual adjustable seats. I found blank switches here and there. It's got a little bitty infotainment screen. It was a bit surprising because this is a vehicle that starts in the high $58,000 range. And granted, this is based on the Land Cruiser Prado and the actual Land Cruiser Prado, not the Lexus GX version that we've had in the US for ages. Has always been actually a pretty Spartan vehicle inside. Like, you're paying for the capability, and that's kind of the case here with the Land Cruiser 1958. You're buying it for kind of the Land Cruiseriness. Like, I guess one of the other things that was kind of surprising is that the interior is actually a bit on the narrow side too. It was just interesting. All that aside, the iForce Max hybrid turbo powertrain, really, really nice. Pulls really strong, very smooth. Actually, like, you can hear a fair bit of turbo whistle, kind of reminiscent of sort of like a big old turbo diesel. And I say that in a very good way, and I think a lot of Land Cruiser owners would probably enjoy that. Transmission shifts really smoothly, and being a hybrid, it's got a great coasting function. So coming up to a stoplight or something, it shuts off the engine really smoothly and very early. So kind of little fuel savings here and there. Yeah, so it's interesting. It does drive well. It's fairly spacious, but it does feel fairly bare bones for how much money you're paying for it.
All right. So this is, it's the Land Cruiser. It's one of the probably top 5 most talked about vehicles in the industry. Do you think this kind of measures up in its new form? I mean, it went from this enormous 3-row crossover luxury barge thing to a bit of a Wrangler competitor. Did they make that transition in your assessment?
I mean, I think so. It's a lot cheaper than the old Land Cruiser.
Yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't call it cheap, but it is, probably not. It's a little bit more than half of what the old Land Cruiser costs. So I mean, yeah, it's definitely a lot cheaper. I guess the main thing that I'm concerned about is how it is going to coexist with 4Runner.
Mm-hmm.
Because, if you look at the dimensions, they're darn near, they're almost identical. I mean, it's almost like you're just paying for a different look. I mean, that may be kind of the case. It does feel like it is, super niche now. So, I mean, we'll see how that goes. It might be that there's kind of a higher end to Land Cruiser than there is to 4Runner. But it is kind of a concern of mine.
What about the Lexus GX?
I'm not entirely sure there's as much crossover there. Because I think the styling, the badging, all of that, it's a different vibe. Whereas I think there's a lot more kind of cross-shopping between a 4Runner and Land Cruiser as opposed to a GX and a Land Cruiser.
Fair.
I mean, even if they're technically closer to each other, the GX and Land Cruiser are basically the same vehicle in a lot of ways. But I think it's one of those funny psychological things about the badge on it making all the difference.
If I didn't know there were no badges, I would probably pick the GX. Just without badges, I like the overall aesthetics. I like some of the things they've done just with the suspension and just the interior. It just seems a little bougier, a little more comfortable for daily driving. But I mean, if you're asking me based on overall, because badges are a thing, I would probably go 4Runner. I've always liked the 4Runner. It's a little hard for me to almost detach what these things have been for so long, because in my head, yeah, the Land Cruiser back in the 80s, in the 90s was this thing that they're trying to return it to, more of a Wrangler competitor, for lack of a better way to describe it. But it was a huge 3-row, coastal SUV for 2 decades, longer than that. So it's at what point does it stop being what it used to be and become what it was for so long? So I think for a lot of people, it's a little confusing, even though the Land Cruiser heritage is so strong. And they always traded off of that too, with the 3-row version to make it seem like it was just this, throwback to this other time. And then the 4Runner too. I mean, part of me also thinks you might want to even look at the outgoing 4Runner if you like the V6. It's not fuel efficient, but I mean, maybe that's more of what the 4Runner you want is. So all that is to say, I think these are strong products. And I think I give credit to Toyota for really servicing the off-road, crowd. I mean, they really are going for it. How other companies don't have anything like this, and they've got 3. So, and they're new and they're investing in them. So, I mean, that's something. So, speaking of off-road, you drove the Sterrato. I drove it last week. Senior editor for all things electric in green drove it. That's John Snyder, which was not part of his duties as the green editor. He, driving a V10 Lambo. I kind of like the Dakar more than 911 that I drove a couple weeks prior. But this is wild. It was a lot of fun. It's definitely a flex. What did you think of this beast?
I really fell hard for it. It's a pretty awesome car. And
I came away liking it more than the Dakar.
How come?
But I think
what I came away from both of them feeling is that while they are ostensibly sort of aiming to solve the same problem, they are different vehicles with kind of different purposes. I think the Dakar is the one that I would legitimately want to take like to a rallycross or something and drive it really hard in the dirt. Because it's got more ground clearance. It seems to have tires that are much more biased to off-road, because that thing was just squealing and howling, like taking turns that my Suburban wouldn't even like freak out over. And the Dakar just feels a whole lot more sort of buttoned down and serious, whereas the Lamborghini is loud and silly and goofy, and I love it for that. And the one that they gave us was bright orange.
That was awesome.
The V10 makes amazing sounds. Revving it out to 85 to that 8,500 RPM red line is so good. It just it howls, and it pops and bangs, and it's just a goofy car. The tires on it, they are all-terrains, but they seem to have more pavement grip than the Dakar ones, which made it more fun for me on the street. And having that soundtrack just made it a lot more fun on the street also. The Turbo Flat 6 in the Porsche is not the most inspiring sounding engine in the world.
Lambo wins on engine all day long. You're not wrong there.
And yeah, in general, I think the Lamborghini is a little bit more fun on pavement, and frankly, that's where most of these are going to be driving. And so, in a lot of ways, it's like I think I prefer the Lamborghini, and just because it's just silly and fun, and it just made me giggle like all the time when I was driving it, and surprisingly, like the seats in it were, I think, more comfortable and easier to get in and out of than the Porsche, which, boy, how often are you going to say, like, it was easier and more comfortable to get into a Lamborghini than it was a 911? And it's also like a Lamborghini that you can drive anywhere and just not worry about it. Like, it's got enough tire and suspension that you can go over potholes and like curbs without too much issue. And like, it's got these black rubberized fender flares and things on it that, I mean, sure, you don't want to bump it, but like if you do, it's less likely you're going to do like thousands and thousands of dollars of carbon fiber damage because you've got this big plastic flare over the side. Yeah, I really liked it. And I was sad to see it go.
All right. Well, I think, I hope listeners, you've enjoyed kind of living vicariously through our time in the Lambo and the Porsche. It's been a hell of a good June as far as like fun press cars that we've been doing our best to create a lot of good content on. You're doing a road test for this, and obviously we've talked about this on 2 straight podcasts. I'm going to have a 5 thoughts on it coming up, so lots of good stuff on the Huracán Sterrato. So with that, let's spend some money. Anthony writes, longtime listener, been a while since I've written in to spend my money. Hopefully this is a good discussion. Oh, I think it will be. I've got a 2020 Chevy Colorado ZR2. I'm considering making the switch to electric. Generally, I'm conscious about the environment these days, but I'm having a really hard time finding any sort of equivalent options at that premium mid-sized truck segment. My first obvious choice is the Rivian R1T, which is a little larger, if I understand, but also more in line with the full-size truck price ranges that can easily hit 6 figures. that kind of sums it up pretty well, Anthony. It really does. The new Tacoma has a hybrid option with an off-road trim, but nothing at the TRD Pro level. Everything else, including the F-150 Lightning, is either much larger or too expensive. I don't know if I just need to wait a few more years for more affordable or mid-size options to become available, or if I just need to accept the fact that transitioning to electric is going to come at a premium on top of the already inflated mid-size truck prices that we're seeing with the new generation offerings. Would love to know if there's anything I'm missing or not considering. Thanks for the time. Keep up the great work on the podcast. Cheers. Hey, cheers to you. Thanks for writing, Anthony. We'll kick it over to you, Joel. What do you think?
So, if you want to kind of go to any sort of amount of electrification, right now, like it is going to be, for full electric, it's definitely going to be full-size trucks for the most part, with the exception of the R1T for now. And genuinely, it's not really that much bigger than like Tacoma or Colorado. It's a little bit, but genuinely not that much. So I think you would actually be pretty comfortable with it. And price-wise, it can be expensive, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. It starts at about $70,000. And again, like that's not cheap by any means. And I think you can probably get like an F-150 Lightning for a bit less than that. But as you said, like you don't necessarily want to go to like a full-sizer. So it's probably worth it to go with the Rivian in that case. And the thing is, and like I say that the Rivian is at $70,000 isn't necessarily that much more expensive, because the hybrid options that you're going to be looking at coming out on the mid-size trucks, like within the year, are not going to be particularly cheap either. So, I mean, coming the most soon will be the Tacoma with the iForce Max engine. And that one will be available with like the top spec off-road versions. Like that's what the TRD Pro and the Trail Hunter are going to be offered with. And you can even get it with like TRD Off-Road Pack with the iForce Max engine. And if we take that TRD Off-Road iForce Max, that starts in the mid $40,000, which is, that's a big that's much less than the Rivian. But if you're looking at like, you want all the off-road goodies, the Trail Hunter and the TRD Pro, they're both over $60,000 to get one of those. And the thing is, the iForce Max is much more about performance than it is fuel economy. Like the iForce Max, it's the most it's getting is about 24 miles per gallon on the highway, which is not bad, but it's also not what you would kind of expect from like an efficiency-minded hybrid. So, depending on your need, I mean, I think you'd get a good truck, but I'm assuming that if you're looking at full electric, you are looking at like trying to reduce the amount of gas you're using. So in that case, I would kind of lean toward the Rivian. But the thing that I would bring up is that also in about a year, we should be seeing the Jeep Gladiator plug 4xe, which would be a plug-in hybrid. And obviously, like as long as you're plugging it in, which you should be, you can get significantly better fuel economy than say like that Toyota with the iForce Max engine. And it probably will be cheaper than the Rivian. That's not to say that it'll be cheap. A Wrangler 4xe starts at a little over $50,000. So I think it would be safe to assume that the Gladiator 4xe will start somewhere in that $50,000 range. Whether it'll be low or high, we have yet to see. And granted, being a Gladiator, it will be like a Wrangler pickup truck, and so you do have some refinement things. So I guess there's not necessarily one easy answer here. But I would definitely say wait a little bit longer, just so that like the iForce Max Toyotas are out, and the Gladiator 4xe are out, so that you have a chance to go and check those out. And if neither of those if none of those do it for you, then I'd say the Rivian is probably your best bet.
All right. Sounds good. So here's how I would break things down. I would say, and these are some questions you kind of got to answer yourself. How serious, how much do you want to go electric? And do you want to do this right now? Because if you're really electric and you want to do it now, you got to go Rivian, because that's available right now. I've driven the R1T. I really liked it. It's a pretty big truck. It's closer to a full size than a midsize. That being said, it's the only thing I've driven that really splits the field right in between. It's not a huge truck. It's very drivable. It's based, on the same setup as the R1S, which is a crossover. So it's Rivian pitches this as a lifestyle truck, not as like an F-150 fighter. So I think you would be right at home in that, especially given the fact that the Colorado, which you own, and the Ranger are pretty big trucks these days. So I think the size would work, is what I'm trying to say. They also just recently upgraded it for the new model year. I don't think they're out quite yet, but it was a lot of under the skin stuff, kind of software, electrical, the real kind of nerdy engineering stuff. They look about the same. So you can read our review from Jonathan Ramsey, one of our longest running contributors, and decide if you want to wait for the next model. If you want to go spec one out right now, the 2024 R1T Adventure, this is the dual standard. I just did this right while you were kind of talking. Your estimated price will be $72,150. Doesn't include taxes. It also doesn't include incentives. So, to me, that's a pretty reasonable price. You get things like the dual motor. I splurged and put an extra $1,750 down to get the forest green, because I think it fits with this. 21-inch wheels, Rivian elevation audio. I don't know what that is, but it sounds good, pun intended. You get the tonneau cover for $500 extra, which I would take on the Rivian R1T and many other pickup trucks. I just think it's very useful. And the panoramic glass roof. Nicely equipped. Estimated delivery is 1 to 6 weeks. So, right now, I think a lot of times when people are looking for help, they want a direct answer. That's probably option number one. I think that's good. Number two, if you want to go hybrid, I've driven the Wrangler 4xe. I think it's solid. I think you want to have a home charger, or perhaps a charger at your place of business if you have an office. That way you can make the most of its electric range, because it's not a quick charger. So you've got to be able to charge it, let it sit for a while, and get that maximum, 25 miles of range, somewhere in there. You want to get that. All that is to extrapolate over to the Gladiator, assuming it's a similar setup, which we think it will be. I would do that. I just kind of like the Gladiator slightly more than the Taco hybrid right now. So, but also I really like the Tacoma. So that would be my order. Kind of ask yourself those two questions. Do you really want to go electric, and do you want to do it right now? Answer is yes, Rivian. If it's no, you kind of want to play the field a little bit. I do Gladiator 4xe when it comes. And third would be the Taco, which I think is a great truck. And I think you'd be happy with all these things. I really do. As I look sort of into my crystal ball, my guess is somebody else is going to roll out another hybrid or electric truck. But at this moment in time, we just don't know what that is. If we did, we would report that. There's the Maverick hybrid out there as well. The Ram Revolution sort of extended range hybrid is also on the horizon. But if you're still trying to stay in that mid-sized thing, you definitely don't want to jump up to a Ram. So Rivian's been a bit of a thread of this podcast. So I think, I'm pretty comfortable with that answer. So
yeah. And the thing is, like, Maverick hybrid would be great. It's just that if you're coming from Colorado ZR2,
it's not going to even come remotely close to the off-road capability.
And so, I think both of us, like, if it's got to be now, it's Rivian. Ideally, just wait a little bit. And I think both of us kind of think Gladiator 4xe would be a very strong choice, especially in Rubicon package.
Indeed.
Because then you would have
the potential for a lot of electrification. And this is for anybody listening. If you've got a plug-in hybrid, please plug it in. You're not going to get the benefits of it if you don't. But I mean, the benefits are there if you do. And so in a lot of ways, Gladiator 4xe Rubicon would be really good. And I think we're both kind of in agreement that Tacoma iForce Max, solid option, but it's not really like if you're trying to get more electrification and better fuel economy, it's not necessarily the way to go.
Indeed. And if you go all the way back almost a year, we had the original Gladiator 4xe scoop reporting. I actually did that just to let you guys know that, hey, Autoblog, we try to bring you this like forward-looking news. That's who we are as we celebrate our 20th anniversary here. And that's all the time we have this week on the Autoblog Podcast. Thanks for hanging out, Joel. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Be safe out there. Enjoy your week. And please give us 5 stars if you so choose on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get the show. If you'd like to spend, like us to spend your money, like Anthony, that's podcast@autoblog.com. Hey, be safe out there. We'll see you next week.